She was dying on his territory, and didn't even know it. The woman on the bench clutched her baby like a shield, frost forming on her ragged coat. The Mafia boss watching from the shadows had two choices: walk away like he always did, or make the one decision that would turn his empire inside out. He chose wrong. Or maybe he chose right. You decide. But before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's see how one moment of cruelty changed everything.
Dante stepped onto the pavement before midnight, his leather shoes hitting concrete with the finality of a judge's gavel. Blood still stained his knuckles, dried and dark beneath the flickering streetlight. Another debt collected. Another message sent. His empire stood silent behind him, built on fear and absolute control, every brick mortared with ruthlessness. He was used to this, the weight of power, the cold mathematics of survival, the way men's eyes dropped when he entered a room. But that night felt different, heavy, uncertain. A strange chill drifted through the alley that had nothing to do with winter. He walked toward the corner for air, away from the suffocating silence of his SUV, away from the bodyguards who watched him like he was made of stone instead of flesh. The city breathed around him, dangerous and familiar, every shadow a potential threat he'd learned to read like text. He owned these streets. Every dealer, every desperate soul, every crime committed here paid tribute to his name. And then he saw her. On a metal bench beside the graffitied wall, beneath a dying street lamp that buzzed and flickered, a young woman lay curled against the armrest. Desperate. Exhausted. Wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen too many winters. But it wasn't her poverty that stopped him cold. It was what she held. In her arms, protected by her body like a fortress made of bone and determination, was a baby. The sight struck him like a bullet, sudden and breathtaking. Her scarf, faded and thin, was wrapped around the child, shielding it from the bitter cold that made his own breath visible. Her hands were trembling, cracked and bleeding from exposure, fingers red and swollen. But she never let go. Even in sleep, even in exhaustion that had carved hollows beneath her eyes, her grip remained fierce, protective, absolute. He froze, unable to speak, unable to move. He had built an empire on ruthlessness, crushed men twice his size, made grown soldiers weep with a single look. But this woman, this child, this impossible tableau of vulnerability in his territory. Questions exploded in his mind like grenades. Why was this woman outside in the cold with a child? Where was her family? Her home? Was this desperation or something deeper, something he couldn't name? He moved closer, quietly, his footsteps careful for the first time in years, afraid of what he might find, afraid of what he might disturb. The baby's tiny hand gripped her jacket, fingers smaller than his thumb, clutching the fabric like it was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Its chest rose and fell softly, rhythmically. Safe. Warm. Calm. She had given the child everything she had, even heat from her own failing body. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin stretched too tight, hollow with exhaustion that went bone deep. But there was something else there too. Peace. It wasn't a picture of surrender, of giving up, of defeat. It was love. Love so fierce, so completely beyond his understanding, it needed no explanation. She had nothing. Not shelter, not food, not even basic warmth. But she had this child, and that was somehow enough. Steam rose from her parted lips, small clouds in the freezing air. The baby's hat had slipped, and without waking, she adjusted it with trembling fingers, tucking dark hair beneath wool. The gesture was so gentle, so automatic, so filled with tenderness that something cracked in Dante's chest, a fissure in armor he'd spent 30 years building. He stood there in silence, his shadow falling across them both, this man who had everything standing before this woman who had nothing. The graffiti behind her screamed territorial claims in spray paint. His claims. His streets. His city. But somehow, in this moment, she was stronger than he'd ever been. She was protecting something that mattered. And he, with all his power, all his wealth, all his carefully constructed dominance, suddenly felt hollow. He realized, with the certainty of revelation, that this moment would shatter everything he believed about strength. That real power wasn't found in fear or control or the ability to destroy. It was found here on a freezing bench, in hands too weak to fight but too strong to surrender. In a love that survived when everything else had been stripped away. The woman slept on, unaware she was being watched. Unaware that the most dangerous man in the city stood 3 feet away, his entire worldview crumbling like ash in the wind. The baby stirred, nestling deeper into her arms, and she held tighter even in unconsciousness. And Dante knew, with absolute clarity, that nothing would ever be the same. Her name was Elena, though few people bothered to learn it. She was the homeless mother no one noticed, the shadow passing through crowded streets with her head down and her baby bundled against her chest. She survived without complaint, spoke only when desperation forced her to beg for spare change, her voice barely rising above a whisper. She had no family who would claim her, no wealth beyond the clothes on her back and the threadbare blanket wrapped around her son. But she had him, this tiny life that depended on her completely, and she protected him like he was all that remained of her soul. During the day, she wandered through the city with quiet determination, humming lullabies in a language Dante wouldn't recognize, melodies from a life she'd left behind. She smiled through pain no one ever witnessed, her face composed even when hunger gnawed at her stomach and exhaustion made her limbs shake. Every decision she made, every step she took, every breath she drew existed for one purpose: keeping her baby alive. But that night had been colder than most, the kind of cold that bit through fabric and settled into bone. She'd arrived at the shelter just after sunset, hope flickering in her chest, only to face the administrator's apologetic shake of the head. Full. Completely full. Try again tomorrow. The baby had cried endlessly in her arms as she walked away, his wails piercing the frozen air, breaking her heart with every sound. She waited at the church steps for an hour, maybe 2, praying someone would hear her knocking. The heavy wooden doors remained locked, silent, indifferent. The soup kitchen displayed its handwritten sign: closed for repairs. Return Friday. But Friday was 3 days away, and tonight was now, and her baby wouldn't stop crying. So she did what any mother's heart would do when the world offered nothing. She found the bench beneath the flickering streetlight, wrapped the baby tighter in her scarf until only his small face showed, and rocked him gently under the neon lights. Back and forth, singing softly while tears froze on her cheeks. Slowly, mercifully, the crying stopped. His breathing steadied. His tiny fist unclenched. The bench became her cradle, the night her only blanket. She stayed awake for hours, afraid to close her eyes, afraid he might get cold if she stopped paying attention. But exhaustion is a patient enemy. It crept through her defenses, pulled at her consciousness like an undertow. She didn't mean to fall asleep, just rest her eyes for a moment. But love had kept her vigilant longer than strength could sustain, and eventually, her body surrendered. The baby slept peacefully through it all, warm against her failing heat, safe in arms that refused to let go even in unconsciousness. When Dante found her, he saw only the surface: a homeless woman, a vulnerable child, a problem in his territory. But beneath that simple image lay sacrifice of a magnitude he couldn't comprehend, the kind only the truly desperate understand. Truth, in that moment, looked nothing like what he'd imagined. He stood there in the freezing darkness, his emotions colliding like thunder inside his chest. Anger at the world that allowed this. Confusion at why it affected him so deeply. Protectiveness rising like a tidal wave he couldn't control. Fear of what it meant that he cared at all. His voice, when it finally came, was softer than he intended. Elena. She woke with a start, her body jerking upright, arms instinctively clutching the baby tighter against her chest. Her eyes flew open, wild with panic, and widened when she saw him standing there in the flickering streetlight. This stranger in an expensive suit, blood still staining his knuckles, his presence both terrifying and magnetic. She knew what men like him were capable of. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Don't hurt us. I'll leave. I'm sorry." The apology tumbled out before she could stop it. Automatic, desperate. "I didn't know this was someone's place. We'll go. Please." The words broke before her tears did, fracturing in the cold air between them. The baby stirred against her shoulder but didn't cry, somehow sensing his mother's fear. Dante took a step closer, his shadow falling across them both, and his voice came out low and dangerous despite his intentions. "You're sleeping on the street with a child." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, though he didn't know who he was accusing. Her. Himself. The entire broken system. She nodded slowly, eyes downcast, unable to meet his gaze. "The shelter was full, sir." He wouldn't stop crying from the cold. Her voice was barely audible now, defeated. "I tried everywhere. The church. The mission. Everywhere." He froze, the words hitting him deeper than expected. Cutting through armor he'd spent decades forging. Something twisted inside him, sharp and unfamiliar, a feeling he couldn't name because he'd buried it so long ago. He had been too consumed with building his empire, collecting debts, eliminating threats, expanding territory. Too focused on power to notice the suffering happening in the very streets he controlled. This baby's only warmth came not from the system he paid taxes to, not from the social services that should exist, but from her sacrifice alone. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, vast and profound. He looked at her trembling hands, cracked and bleeding from exposure, then at the child nestled peacefully in her arms. Something cracked inside him. Not anger. Recognition. The terrible recognition of his own failure. He whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't hide. "You could freeze to death out here." She smiled weakly, tears finally falling, tracing clean lines down her dirt-stained cheeks. "As long as he's alive, I'm alive." The statement was simple, absolute, devastating in its honesty. He had never heard survival sound so human, so raw, so completely beyond his understanding of strength. And for the first time in his entire violent life, the Mafia boss felt powerless. Later that night, he did something he never did. Something his advisors would call weakness, his enemies would call foolish, his instincts screamed against. He offered help. "Come with me," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. He gestured toward the black SUV idling at the curb, its engine purring softly in the frozen air. She hesitated, her entire body tensing with uncertainty. Fear and desperation warred in her eyes, two powerful forces pulling her in opposite directions. She'd learned the hard way that men who offered help often wanted something in return, something she could never afford to give. But the cold was brutal, the baby was shivering despite her best efforts, and somewhere beneath her terror lived a tiny flame of hope she thought had died months ago. He saw the conflict written across her face and took a different approach. He wanted to understand, really understand what had brought her to this bench, to this moment, to this impossible choice between survival and safety. "There's a place nearby," he said carefully, reading her fear like text. "Warm. Safe. You can rest. Feed him." He paused, letting the words settle. "No strings. Just shelter for tonight." She clutched her baby tightly, her arms trembling with exhaustion and indecision. The child stirred, whimpering softly, and that small sound seemed to decide everything. She nodded once, quick and fearful, before she could change her mind. The drive was silent except for the baby's soft breathing. She sat rigid in the back seat, every muscle coiled for flight, watching the city pass outside the tinted windows. When they arrived at a nondescript building, reinforced steel doors, security cameras everywhere, her fear spiked again. But he led her inside to a simple room, clean and warm, with a bed that looked impossibly soft and a bathroom with running water. Luxuries she'd almost forgotten existed. He gave her space to settle the baby, watching from the doorway as she laid him gently on the bed, her movements careful and practiced. When she finally sat down, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave, he pulled up a chair and sat across from her. Not too close. Respectful of the distance fear required. He said softly, meeting her eyes with unexpected sincerity, "Tell me the truth, Elena." And so she did. The words came slowly at first, halting and painful, like pulling shrapnel from an old wound. She told him about the family she once had, back when hope seemed reasonable and futures seemed possible. About the man she'd married young, too young, mistaking intensity for love. About how everything changed when money ran out and desperation moved in. Her husband turned violent, his fists replacing his promises, his rage consuming everything gentle between them. Then came the baby boy, born into chaos, arriving in the middle of their collapsing world. Her voice shook with every word as she described holding her newborn son while her husband screamed about another mouth to feed, about her failure, about his disappointment. "I tried to leave," she whispered, staring at her cracked hands. "Packed a bag while he was at work. Made it 3 blocks before he found me." Her breathing quickened at the memory. "He beat me in the street. In front of everyone. Said he'd take my son if I ever tried again. Said I'd never see him, that he'd make sure I lost him forever." She looked down at the sleeping baby, her expression fierce despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "So I ran. Really ran this time. Middle of the night. Left everything behind." She paused, tears streaming freely now, catching the dim lamplight. "Lost everything. My apartment, my job, my savings. My family disowned me for abandoning him, said I was breaking up the family, that I should try harder to make it work." Her voice dripped with bitter irony. They didn't see the bruises. Didn't want to see them. The silence stretched between them, heavy with truths too painful to rush past. She continued, her voice breaking completely. "I couldn't let him take my baby. I couldn't." The words fractured like glass. "He used to say terrible things about what he'd do if I left. How he'd raise our son to hate me. How he'd teach him that women were worthless." Her hands trembled as she wiped her face. "So I chose the streets. Because at least here I can see danger coming. At least here we're together. At least here, he's mine and I'm his and nobody can tell me I'm not enough." The defiance in her voice cut through the sadness like a blade. "We're hungry and cold and scared, but we're free. And some days that's everything." The alley outside went silent. Even the distant traffic seemed to stop, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Dante's jaw clenched, muscles working beneath his skin. His hands formed fists at his sides, knuckles white with tension. He saw the pain she carried like chains wrapped around her soul, heavy and cutting. And he saw the love she gave that shouldn't have survived such brutality. Yet she gave it anyway, fierce and absolute and unbreakable. She had nothing left to live for except this child. Nothing. Her care wasn't desperation born of obligation. It was defiance born of choice. Every lullaby she sang was rebellion against a world that tried to break her. Every night she survived was proof that love could outlast violence, that tenderness could endure when everything else burned away. Dante bowed his head, something shifting deep in his chest, some fundamental understanding rearranging itself. He had an empire built on fear but no peace in his soul. She had grief that would crush most people but also grace that somehow survived it. And in that moment he realized with absolute clarity that she was stronger than anyone in his organization, braver than his most ruthless soldiers, more powerful than any weapon he possessed. The bench wasn't just metal and wood. It was where broken spirits refused to surrender, where love made its final stand, where a woman with nothing proved she had everything that mattered. That morning, as gray light filtered through the reinforced windows, Dante made a call that would change everything. His voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the urgency his words demanded. "Marco, get everyone to the warehouse. Now." Within the hour, his inner circle gathered in the vast concrete space that served as their headquarters. Confusion etched across hardened faces. They arrived expecting another operation, another territory dispute, another problem requiring their particular brand of solution. The air smelled of motor oil and old cigarettes, and their footsteps echoed against walls that had witnessed countless meetings, countless decisions that shaped the underworld they controlled. Dante stood at the center, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his usual composure replaced by something his men couldn't quite identify. Behind him, partially hidden in the shadows near the office door, stood Elena with her baby. She looked terrified, out of place, her worn clothing and hollow cheeks a stark contrast to the expensive suits and confident swagger surrounding her. Marco arrived last, his lieutenant's instincts immediately sensing something wrong. He scanned the room, noted his boss's unusual demeanor, saw the woman, and his expression darkened with concern. "Boss," he said carefully, waiting for explanation. Dante's voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost reverent, carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. "This woman," he said, nodding toward Elena, "needs protection." The words hung in the air like smoke. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then gasps filled the warehouse, shock rippling through the gathered men like electricity. Soldiers exchanged glances. Veterans who'd served Dante for years looked at each other in disbelief. Someone muttered something under their breath that sounded like disbelief mixed with profanity. Marco stepped forward, his face flushing red, fury barely contained behind professional restraint. His jaw worked as he struggled to choose his words carefully. "Boss," he said slowly, dangerously, "you can't be serious." He gestured toward Elena without looking at her, his hand trembling slightly. "She's homeless. A nobody. No offense to her, but this is madness. We don't do charity cases. We can't afford to." Other voices joined in, a chorus of concern and confusion. "What about operational security?" someone called out. "How do we know she's not working for the Calabrese family?" Another added. "Boss, with all due respect, this makes us look weak." Dante let them talk, let the objections build and crash against him like waves against stone. His expression remained neutral, patient, almost detached. When the voices finally died down, when the warehouse returned to tense silence, his eyes went cold as steel. That look, that particular Arctic fury his men knew too well, swept across the room and everyone felt it. "She slept in the freezing cold to keep her son alive," he said, his voice cutting through the space like a blade. Each word was measured, deliberate, devastating. "While we slept in comfort, in heated homes, in beds we didn't earn, making money off others' suffering." His words echoed through concrete walls like accusations, like judgments pronounced from on high. "We've built an empire on fear and violence, and not once did any of us notice a mother dying on our streets to protect her child." The silence that followed was absolute. Men who'd faced down rival gangs, who'd stared at gun barrels without flinching, suddenly found the floor fascinating. Marco's fury drained from his face, replaced by something closer to shame. Elena stood trembling near the doorway, her arms wrapped protectively around her baby, unsure what was happening, terrified she'd made everything worse by accepting his help. She wanted to run, to disappear, to take back the confession that had led to this moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The men's eyes occasionally flicked toward her, measuring, judging, calculating what her presence meant for their organization. Then Dante did something no one expected, something that would be discussed in hushed tones for years afterward. He turned fully toward Elena, his back to his assembled soldiers, and looked directly at her. His expression softened in a way his men had never witnessed, not in all their years of service, not through countless operations and countless victories. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching ice thaw in unexpected sunlight. "I failed to see your courage," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentleness. The warehouse acoustics amplified his words, made them intimate and public simultaneously. "But today I saw what real strength looks like." He paused, letting that truth settle. "Not the kind we practice here. Not violence or intimidation or fear. Real strength. The kind that survives when everything else has been stripped away." Elena's eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, to protest, to tell him this was too much, but no words came. The baby stirred in her arms, sensing the tension, and she automatically began the gentle rocking motion that had become second nature. Dante continued, his voice growing stronger, more certain. "I'm offering you safety. A place to stay, warm and secure. Protection from the man who hurt you, who threatened to take your son." He gestured around the warehouse, encompassing his entire organization with the movement. "These men, these resources, everything we've built, it means nothing if we can't protect someone who needs it." He promised her dignity. Not charity. Not pity. Dignity. The word resonated through the space, foreign and powerful. His men shifted uncomfortably, their worldview cracking along fault lines they didn't know existed. Whispers erupted, careful and shocked. "He's really doing this. I've never seen him like this. What does this mean for us?" No one had seen their boss show mercy before, not genuine mercy untainted by strategy or calculation. This wasn't a business decision. This was something else entirely, something that terrified them because it suggested their leader was capable of change, which meant they might be required to change too. Marco stood frozen, his earlier fury replaced by bewildered acceptance. He'd followed Dante for 15 years, through wars and expansions and near-death encounters. He'd never questioned an order, but he'd also never seen his boss look at anyone the way he looked at this homeless woman and her child. Dante turned back to face his organization, his posture straightening, authority returning like a mantle settling across his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute finality. This woman and her child are under my protection. He paused, letting each man feel the weight of what came next. Anyone who threatens them, anyone who questions this decision, anyone who treats them as anything less than family, answers to me personally. The threat was clear, unmistakable, backed by years of ruthless enforcement. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The warehouse held its breath. This isn't a debate, Dante continued, his tone softer but no less powerful. This is how we evolve. This is how we become something more than thugs collecting debts. We protect people who can't protect themselves. Starting now. Starting with her. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes after declarations that reshape reality. Soldiers exchanged glances, processing, calculating, slowly accepting that their organization had fundamentally changed in the span of a single conversation. And for the first time in years, Elena smiled without fear. Not a big smile, not triumphant or relieved. Just a small, genuine expression of hope tentatively returning. Her grip on her baby loosened slightly, some of the desperate tension leaving her shoulders. She looked at Dante with gratitude so pure it was almost painful to witness. Because sometimes ruthlessness can learn from kindness. Sometimes the hardest men have the softest centers waiting to be discovered. And sometimes a homeless mother's love, fierce and unbreakable and impossibly brave, can teach a mafia boss what honor truly means. The warehouse slowly emptied as men filed out, their world forever altered. Marco lingered, catching Dante's eye. "I'll arrange security," he said simply. No argument. No further protest. Just acceptance. Dante nodded once. "Thank you." And in that moment protection became more than strategy. It became purpose. Days turned into weeks, and Dante's world felt different in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The tension that had defined his existence for decades, the constant vigilance and calculated cruelty, began shifting into something resembling purpose. Distance he'd maintained from everything human was replaced with unexpected connection, subtle but undeniable, like ice melting so slowly you only notice when it's already water. He began to notice the small things. How Elena sang to her baby while organizing the safe house, her voice soft and melodic, filling corners that had only ever echoed with harsh commands and strategic planning. How the child smiled at her first before anyone else, his tiny face lighting up with recognition and trust that seemed almost sacred. How her gentle presence brought light to spaces that had only known darkness, transforming cold functional rooms into something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to home. He watched her closely, not with suspicion the way he watched everyone else, but with respect that grew deeper each day. Every act she performed was filled with intention, nothing wasted, nothing careless. She didn't just survive anymore. She nurtured. She cooked simple meals with whatever ingredients were available, turning provisions into comfort. She organized chaotic spaces with quiet efficiency, creating order without demanding it. She didn't just accept help. She rebuilt her life with quiet determination, brick by invisible brick, establishing routines and rhythms that gave her days structure and her son stability. The baby thrived under her care, growing stronger, more alert, his laughter becoming a regular sound in the compound. Men who'd never smiled at children found themselves pausing to watch him play, their hardened expressions softening involuntarily. Elena's influence spread like dawn, slow and inexorable, changing the atmosphere without anyone quite realizing when it happened. One evening, after the baby was asleep and Elena sat in the small kitchen mending clothes by lamplight, Dante appeared in the doorway holding something small wrapped in plain paper. He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain, before crossing to where she sat. "I brought you something," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He unwrapped the paper to reveal a simple silver bracelet with a small engraved heart, delicate and beautiful in its simplicity. "For the woman who showed me what courage looks like." Elena's hands stilled on the fabric. She looked up at him, surprise and confusion crossing her tired features. "I can't accept this," she said, shaking her head firmly. "I don't need gifts. My son being safe is enough. More than enough." But he insisted, crouching down so they were eye level, his expression sincere in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "You taught me that power means nothing without purpose," he said quietly, holding her gaze. "That protecting the innocent isn't weakness. That everything I've built means nothing if it doesn't stand for something beyond fear." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You gave me a reason to be better than what I was." She smiled then, tears glistening in her exhausted eyes, catching lamplight like stars. Her hand trembled as she accepted the bracelet, and he fastened it gently around her scarred wrist. That moment wasn't about charity or obligation or debt. It was recognition. Recognition of the humanity he'd almost forgotten existed beneath his armor of violence and control. Recognition that strength came in forms he'd never considered, that vulnerability could teach lessons force never could. From that day, his empire felt different. Not because of expanded territory or increased wealth or successful operations. It felt different because of meaning. Because purpose had replaced mere accumulation. Because protecting someone who mattered gave context to everything else they did. And everyone in the organization knew something unprecedented had begun. Something no amount of money could ever create. No amount of power could command. Something fragile and precious and worth defending with everything they had. But life has a way of testing resolve when it matters most, probing weaknesses you didn't know existed, striking at the exact moment you've allowed yourself to believe in safety. 3 weeks after Elena's arrival, on a night that started peaceful and ordinary, everything shattered. The breach happened at 11:43. Later, reviewing security footage, Dante would see the coordinated precision of the attack, the way armed men emerged from 3 different vehicles simultaneously, moving with purpose born of desperation rather than training. But in the moment, there was only chaos. Alarms screamed through the compound. Glass exploded inward. Suddenly, violently, armed men stormed the safe house, their faces covered, their weapons raised, their intentions brutally clear. Panic exploded through the compound like a grenade. Dante's soldiers scrambled, reaching for weapons, establishing defensive positions, shouting commands over the cacophony of breaking glass and splintering wood. He mobilized every resource he had, every contingency plan refined through years of paranoia and preparation. Weapons materialized from hidden compartments. Soldiers poured into corridors from secured positions. Chaos filled every corner, turning the sanctuary he'd built into a war zone. But in the small room where Elena had been putting her baby to sleep, everything went still. She heard the alarms, heard the shouting, heard the unmistakable sound of violence approaching. And instead of panicking, instead of freezing with terror the way she once would have, she became calm, focused, protective. She lifted her baby from the crib, held him close against her chest, and positioned herself in the corner farthest from the door. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing steadied. She whispered promises against his small head, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "I won't let him take you. Never again. I promise, baby. I promise." Dante fought like a man possessed, cutting through attackers with brutal efficiency born of decades surviving in a world that rewarded violence. His movements were economical, precise, each strike calculated for maximum damage. Bodies fell. Blood sprayed across white walls. But something was wrong, fundamentally wrong. These men weren't attacking with the coordination of rival organizations. They weren't trying to eliminate him. They were pushing deeper into the compound, bypassing strategic positions, ignoring his soldiers, moving with singular purpose toward the residential wing. They weren't after him. They were after her. The realization hit him like ice water. He broke from the main fighting, sprinting through corridors he knew by heart, weapon in hand, heart hammering with fear he hadn't felt in years. Behind him, Marco was shouting commands, coordinating the defense, but Dante couldn't wait for backup. He reached Elena's corridor just as the door to her room splintered inward. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a man Dante had never seen but immediately recognized. Elena's ex-husband. His eyes were wild with rage and obsession, his face twisted into something barely human. He held a gun loosely in one hand, his attention fixed entirely on the woman pressed against the far wall, the woman who held his child but would never again be his possession. "You belong to me," he snarled, his voice rough with fury and something darker, something possessive and consuming. "You'll never escape. I told you what would happen. I warned you." He stepped into the room, glass crunching under his boots. "You made me look weak. Made me chase you across the city like some pathetic fool. But it's over now. You're coming home." Elena's fear transformed into fury, a chemical reaction instant and complete. Her body tensed, positioning herself between the threat and her baby. Her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, each word sharp and clear and absolute. "Especially not you." Her eyes blazed with defiance that had been beaten down but never broken. "I stopped being yours the day you raised your fist. I stopped being yours when I chose my son over your violence." Dante appeared behind her abuser like death itself, silent and inevitable. He positioned himself between Elena and the man who'd hurt her, his weapon raised, his expression carved from stone. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes thunder. "You made one mistake." He paused, letting the words settle. "You threatened someone under my protection." The ex-husband spun, surprise flickering across his rage-twisted face. "This doesn't concern you," he spat. "This is family business." "You lost the right to call it family," Dante said softly, "when you used your fists instead of your heart." The confrontation escalated in seconds. The ex-husband raised his weapon. Dante moved faster, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Violence erupted in the small space, brutal and intimate. They crashed against walls, struggled for control of the gun, fought with the desperation of men defending completely different things. One fighting for possession, one fighting for protection. But through it all, Elena didn't cower. She didn't break. She didn't run. She stood her ground, shielding her baby with her body, ready to fight if anyone got past Dante. She protected her child with the same fierce determination that had kept them alive on frozen streets, that had survived beatings and abandonment and crushing poverty. The sounds of fighting filled the corridor outside. Gunfire. Shouting. Breaking furniture. Minutes felt like hours, each second stretching impossibly long. Then, suddenly, the tide turned. Dante's men secured the perimeter, overwhelming the attackers with superior numbers and coordination. Marco appeared in the doorway with 3 soldiers, weapons drawn, immediately assessing the situation. Elena's ex-husband was subdued, driven to his knees, disarmed and bleeding. Dante stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split open, blood staining his shirt. "You'll never see her again," he said quietly. "You'll never speak her name. You'll disappear, and if you ever resurface, you won't survive the encounter." It wasn't a threat. It was prophecy. The man was dragged away, removed permanently from their lives, his shouting fading into the distance until silence reclaimed the compound. The baby, miraculously, remained calm in Elena's arms, his trust in his mother absolute and unshakable. She was trembling now, adrenaline crashing through her system, but she held him steady, humming softly, keeping him safe even as her own composure fractured. Dante turned to her, bleeding but victorious, his expression softening when their eyes met. He crossed the room carefully, giving her space to process, to breathe, to understand that the danger had passed. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. She shook her head, unable to speak, tears finally breaking through her brave facade. He knew what had happened wasn't just security protocol or strategic defense. It was family. Loyalty stronger than blood had saved them. Protection that transcended organization or obligation. The compound fell quiet except for the baby's soft breathing and Elena's whispered gratitude. And that night, Dante learned that some bonds don't need words, only action. That family isn't defined by DNA but by who stands between you and danger when everything collapses. That the woman he'd found on a bench had become something more precious than any territory he'd ever claimed. Time passed with the strange weight of healing, days blending into weeks, and Elena began to feel something unexpected stirring beneath her gratitude. Not fear, which she knew intimately, but doubt. Insidious, creeping doubt that whispered during quiet moments when Dante's men nodded respectfully as she passed, when Marco brought groceries without being asked, when the baby laughed in rooms that had once echoed with violence. She had grown dependent, connected to people and routines that weren't hers, bound by invisible threads she hadn't meant to weave. She feared she was becoming a burden. The thought gnawed at her during sleepless nights, poisoned her relief with guilt she couldn't shake. I don't belong in this world, she told herself in quiet moments, standing at the reinforced windows watching the city she no longer recognized. People will talk. His enemies will use me against him. I'm a weakness he can't afford. The attack had proven that. Her past had followed her here, brought violence to his doorstep, endangered men who'd shown her nothing but protection. She replayed that night endlessly, watching it loop in her mind like terrible footage. The broken glass. The gunfire. The blood on Dante's hands afterward, blood spilled because of her. Because she'd been naive enough to think she could escape her history by accepting his help. She watched Dante closely during those weeks, cataloging the ways her presence changed things. How he checked on her before important meetings. How his attention divided between Empire and her son's well-being. How Marco's security briefings now included contingencies for her safety. She was a variable in equations that used to be simple, a complication in a world that demanded brutal simplicity. The decision formed slowly, painfully, like a bone-setting wrong. She would leave. Not out of ingratitude, but out of love for what he'd given her. She would take the strength he'd helped her rebuild and use it to protect him by removing herself from his life. She packed her small bag one morning while dawn light filtered gray through the windows, her movements silent and practiced. The baby was fed, content, sleeping peacefully in the carrier strapped to her chest. The safe house was still, most of Dante's men on patrol or sleeping after night shifts. She moved through the room gathering the few possessions she'd accumulated, folding clothes donated by Marco's wife, tucking away the silver bracelet Dante had given her, her fingers lingering on the engraved heart. She left a note on the kitchen table, her handwriting shaky but legible. Thank you for everything. You saved us when no one else would. You gave me back my dignity and my son his safety. But I can't endanger your world anymore. My past will always follow me, and I won't let it destroy what you've built. Please don't look for us. We'll be okay. You taught me how to be strong again. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper, as she turned toward the exit, as she reached for the door handle. The baby stirred against her chest, sighing softly, trusting completely that his mother knew what she was doing. But she didn't. She was terrified, broken all over again, leaving the first place that had felt safe since everything collapsed. But before she could turn the handle, before she could step into the hallway and disappear into the city that had nearly killed her, a voice called out behind her. Quiet. Certain. Unmistakable. Leaving without saying goodbye. She froze, her entire body going rigid with shock and shame. She turned slowly to find Dante standing in the doorway to his office, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, looking like he hadn't slept. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that looked like hurt beneath the control. I thought you'd wait until I was gone, he said, his tone flat. More convenient that way. Cleaner. Her eyes filled with tears immediately, hot and unstoppable. I don't belong here, she whispered, the words breaking as they emerged. Your life is dangerous. I'm putting you at risk. That attack, those men came because of me. Because I was stupid enough to think I could hide forever. So you were going to run, he said, not moving from the doorway. Back to the streets. Back to park benches and shelters that turn you away. Back to the same danger you barely escaped. At least I wouldn't be endangering you, she said, her voice rising with desperation. At least your men wouldn't be bleeding because of my mistakes. At least you'd be alone, he interrupted, his voice sharp now, cutting through her rationalizations like a blade. At least you'd be suffering the way you think you deserve to suffer. At least you'd be punishing yourself for having the audacity to accept help. The words hit her like physical blows. She clutched the baby tighter, tears streaming down her face. I'm not worth what it costs to protect me, she choked out. I'm nobody. I'm just. He walked closer, closing the distance between them with measured steps, his expression intense and focused entirely on her. You belong where you're valued, he said firmly, each word deliberate and weighted. Not where you think you deserve to be. Not where guilt tells you to go. Where you're valued. She shook her head, unable to accept what he was saying. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, he said, standing close enough now that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the concern he wasn't bothering to hide. You're terrified that accepting help makes you weak. That needing people makes you vulnerable. That caring about something more than survival makes you a burden. He paused, his jaw tightening. But you're wrong. I brought violence to your home, she whispered. Violence was already here, he said quietly. You brought something else. Something we'd forgotten existed. His expression softened, the hard edges of his control cracking to reveal something raw beneath. You're not a burden, Elena. You're family. The word shattered something inside her. Family. She'd lost that word years ago, had it stripped away by people who should have protected her, had it poisoned by violence and betrayal until it meant nothing but pain. But hearing it from him, from this man who'd built empires on ruthlessness but still remembered how to be gentle, the word felt new. Possible. True. Her tears fell freely now, unstoppable, washing away weeks of accumulated guilt and fear. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice breaking completely. I don't know how to accept help, how to trust that it won't be taken away. He added, his voice gentle but absolute, carrying finality that allowed no argument. You're not leaving. You're staying with us. You and your son. Not as charity. Not as obligation. As family. Because that's what you are now, whether you believe it or not. The baby cooed in her arms as if agreeing, his small hand reaching up to touch her tear-stained face. The gesture was so innocent, so trusting, it broke through her last defenses. She looked down at her son, at this life she'd fought so desperately to protect, and realized he deserved more than her martyr complex. He deserved safety. Stability. A home. The safe house doors remained open behind her, an exit she could still take, an escape still available if she chose it. But her heart, for the first time in years, finally felt secure. Not trapped. Not dependent. Secure. There was a difference, she realized. Dependence came from weakness. This came from choice. She didn't need to run anymore. Not from danger, not from kindness, not from the terrifying possibility that she might deserve something better than survival. Because protection had finally given her something she'd lost years ago, something she thought had died on frozen streets and in violent apartments. Home. And for the first time since fleeing her abuser, since choosing the streets over subjugation, since wrapping her baby in her only scarf and praying they'd survive the night, she believed she deserved it. Okay, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of surrender and acceptance. We'll stay. Dante nodded once, relief flickering across his carefully controlled expression. Good, he said simply. Then, with unexpected gentleness, now put that bag down and come have breakfast. Marco's making pancakes, and he gets offended when people skip his cooking. She laughed through her tears, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful, and followed him back into the compound that had become, against all odds and expectations, home. Seasons changed and time moved forward gently, the way it does when trauma begins to fade and healing takes root. Winter surrendered to spring, spring blazed into summer, and the compound that had once felt like a fortress slowly transformed into something warmer, something that resembled home in ways Dante's properties never had before. The baby grew with the unstoppable momentum of childhood, hitting milestones that Elena marked with quiet joy and careful documentation. Crawling came first, his determined journey across the safehouse floor celebrated by hardened soldiers who pretended they weren't watching. Then walking, those first wobbling steps taken while holding Elena's hands, his face split wide with triumphant laughter. And laughing. God, the laughter. It filled corridors that had only known tension and plotting, echoing off concrete walls like music nobody knew they'd been missing. Wherever he went, Elena followed. Not hovering, not smothering, but present with the steady constancy of gravity. Through first words that came out garbled and beautiful, through first steps that ended in tumbles she kissed better, through first challenges with sharing toys and eating vegetables and sleeping through the night, she was there. His anchor when the world felt overwhelming. His comfort when fears crept in during thunderstorms. His mother in every sense that mattered, teaching him gentleness in a place built on violence, teaching him love in rooms that had forgotten its language. But the transformation wasn't one-sided. Dante grew wiser too, his evolution subtle but profound. He became more measured in his responses, more purposeful in his decisions, less reactive and more strategic. The hot-blooded enforcer who'd solved problems with his fists began considering consequences beyond immediate victory. He no longer built his empire purely on fear, though fear remained a tool in his arsenal. Instead, he focused on strategic protection, on creating networks of loyalty based on mutual benefit rather than terror, on being someone people wanted to work for rather than someone they were forced to obey. Elena became more than someone he helped, more than a charity case or moral project. She became essential to his organization's new direction, though she never asked for the role and barely recognized her own influence. Her presence softened edges without weakening them. Her perspective challenged assumptions without threatening authority. Marco noticed at first, the way the boss listened when Elena spoke, the way her quiet observations about loyalty and trust reshaped security protocols. She never attended meetings or made strategic decisions, but her impact rippled through everything. When Dante considered a violent response to a territorial dispute, he'd think about the boy playing in the next room, about the world he was creating for him to inherit. When soldiers complained about protection detail for civilian informants, Dante would reference Elena's courage on that frozen bench, reminding them what real strength looked like. The boy grew older, his vocabulary expanding, his personality emerging vibrant and curious and surprisingly gentle given his surroundings. He called Dante Papa D, the nickname emerging spontaneously one afternoon when Dante was teaching him to tie his shoes. The words stopped everyone in the room. Dante froze, something cracking in his carefully maintained composure. Elena watched nervously, unsure if she should correct her son, but Dante simply nodded slowly and said, "That's right, kid. Papa D." That nickname meant everything. It meant acceptance of a bond that had formed without permission or planning. It meant family defined by choice rather than blood. It meant the Mafia boss who'd never wanted children now had a son who looked at him with absolute trust and called him Papa with the casual certainty of childhood. The compound was no longer just a fortress, no longer merely a strategic headquarters for criminal operations. It was warmth. It was the smell of Elena's cooking drifting through corridors. It was the boys' toys scattered across Marco's meticulously organized office. It was soldiers teaching a 5-year-old to play cards while carefully avoiding any gambling. It was birthday parties and bedtime stories and arguments about homework that felt shockingly normal in their abnormal context. Every security briefing now included discussions about community outreach, a phrase that would have been laughable 3 years earlier. Dante established programs for homeless families, shelters that actually had space, soup kitchens that stayed open. Not from altruism alone, but from the understanding that protecting your territory meant protecting the people in it, that communities built on support were more stable than communities ruled by fear. From violence to vision. From territory to transformation. The shift happened gradually enough that nobody could point to a single moment of change, but dramatically enough that everyone recognized the organization they served had fundamentally evolved. Rival families watched with confusion and suspicion. Some saw weakness and tested boundaries, learning quickly that Dante's capacity for violence hadn't diminished, only become more selective. Others saw opportunity and reached out tentatively, curious about this new model of operation. And in the center of it all, anchoring everything without trying, was Elena's quiet strength. She never wanted recognition, never sought influence or status. She declined offers to formalize her position, to accept titles or responsibilities beyond caring for her son. She remained who she'd always been, a mother doing her best to raise her child safely, to give him opportunities she'd never had, to teach him kindness in a world that often rewarded cruelty. Her greatest achievement wasn't changing a criminal organization or softening a dangerous man. It was seeing her son grow up safe, watching him attend school without fear, make friends without her terror poisoning every interaction, dream about futures that extended beyond survival. Knowing the choice she made on that freezing night, to wrap him in her scarf and protect him with her body and refuse to surrender despite having nothing, had led to something beautiful.
Thank you for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Imperial Stories for more amazing stories like this.